slave nation loses the privileges of a nation as the slave does those of a free man. It loses the privilege of taxing itself, of making its own laws, of having any share in their administration or in the general governance of the country. End of quote. A set of questions do need to be raised. One, how did the British succeed in enslaving India with such ease? Two, was there an India as a cohesive entity or a set of disparate territorial entities oblivious to wider processes underway? And three, did these lead to active or passive resistance? Was there any social, intellectual, or ideological awareness about these changes? An answer to the second question perhaps helps understand the process by which the British succeeded. A European scholar, writing in the year 1853, addressed it and analyzed the ground reality, and I quote him: "The paramount power of the great Mughals was broken by Mughal viceroys. The power of the viceroys was broken by the Marathas. The power of the Marathas was broken by the Afghans. And while all were struggling against all, the Briton rushed in and was enabled to subdue them all." We need to accept that there was in that initial period no India politically or emotionally. The encroachment by the East India Company was piecemeal, and resentment or resistance was perforce local. It often took the shape of peasant uprisings motivated by economic deprivation of severe character, often inflicted through physical brutality or ethnic persecution. It was at times led by local landlords. Some of these conflicts involved large numbers, but organized military confrontation of the type with Tipu Sultan of Mysore were the exception. Nevertheless, these popular resistance movements continued for almost a century. The timeline of the progress of British control and Indian resistance to it tells its own story. The Battle of Pilasi, 1757, Sannyasi Rebellion in North Bengal, 1763, the Battle of Buxar, 1764, the Battle of Sringapatna, 1799, the last battle with the Marathas, 1818 and 19, and the First War of Independence, 1957. What was the process of awakening in terms of perceptions? In 1803, the theologian Shah Abdul Aziz of Delhi proclaimed, and I quote him, "Our country has been enslaved. The struggle for independence to put an end to this slavery is our duty." End of quote. This conditioned Muslim perceptions till well after 1857. In Bengal, the presence of the foreigner induced Ram Mohan Roy's introspection to re-examine the presuppositions of his own society and initiate a reformation in the second and third decade of the 19th century. Demand for freedom of press followed. Alongside, resentment to foreign rule developed and culminated in the upheaval of 1857 that shook the British rule to its foundations. It is another matter that it failed in the face of superior military technology and organization. After the travails of 1857, good sections of our people, particularly feudals and affluent classes, responded to the British policy of co-option and reconciled themselves, partially or wholly, to aspects of British rule. They also developed newer methods of dissent and protest. Apart from political activities within permissible limits and occasional resort to individual or group acts of violence against the state, activists resorted to the pen, particularly satirical poetry, often in Urdu. And I quote one couplet, "Khencho na kamano ko, na talwar nikalo, khencho na kamano ko, na talwar nikalo, jab top muqabil ho, to akhbar nikalo." Some years back, the National Archives published a collection of poems that were confiscated by the government for being seditious. They were not even kept here, they were kept in the India office in London. One of these, bearing the caption "Khoon-e-Shahidan," opened with a telling verse, "Nahi mirta nishane khoon kabhi damane qatil se, nahi mirta nishane khoon kabhi damane qatil se, likhi jati hai ek tahreer khooni khoon-e-bismil se." Dr. Tharoor's chapter 4 and 5 dwell on the methodology by which the divide it emperor was implemented. The author rightly points out that it was effectively and regularly supplemented by famine, forced migration, and brutality. The three examples of which British rule over India was despotic and anything but enlightened. But is this not the story of all colonial and imperial ventures? Thank you. Jai Hind.
May I also, on behalf of the publishers and certainly of all of us, I think, thank the Vice President for those very thought-provoking, stimulating words on the occasion of his launching this book. It's now officially released, and I must say that one of the things that I've enjoyed about the process of writing it and now listening to the Vice President has been the realization that how much fecundity there is in the material, that one can not only disagree with some of my approaches and conclusions, but agree with them and have more to say with more insights, more quotes, and more facts, as he has demonstrated, than I have even put in. So I hope that this will really be, even if the book to some people may just be manure, let it be the manure on which 1,000 flowers will bloom. But with those words, I want to again thank you so very much, dear Hamid Bhai, dear Vice President, for this extremely generous decision on your part to agree to launch this book here. A vote of thanks really should be as brief as possible, so I'll end with those words. Thank you very much, sir, and looking forward to hearing from you more often in our public life. Thank you very much.
Continue with your discussion. I'm afraid I have to. Bye-bye.
Have Mr. Karan Thapar in conversation with Dr. Tharoor. Mr. Karan Thapar, a distinguished television journalist, commentator and a columnist. He is currently associated with India Today TV and hosts the show To The Point and Nothing But The Truth. Over to you, Mr. Thapar.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Shashi, let's start with those sections of your book where you have a pretty strong and convincing case to make against the British Raj. And then, towards the end, come to those areas where perhaps, how shall I put it politely, your views are questionable. And
Don't be
let's start-
polite, it's all right.
And let's start with the economy. You point out that in 1600, when the East India Company was established, India's share of world GDP was 23%, Britain's was just 1.8. By the time the British ruled and left India, their share had shot up to 10%, India's had plummeted to 1.8. So I take it the basic motivation of your book is to point out that Britain became a prosperous country by impoverishing India.
Exactly. The rise of Britain for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India and to a lesser degree in the other colonies, but certainly we were the principal cash cow for Britain throughout the 19th century.
In fact, you have several examples in your book, some very telling ones about how this impoverization happened. And to me, I think the most telling is the story of what happened to Indian textiles. You point out that at the start of the 18th century, India had a 25% share of global trade in textiles. By the time the British left, not only was that completely destroyed, but actually the Indian market was being flooded with British cloth. Explain to the audience exactly what steps the British took to reduce India to this state.
Oh, they took a whole lot of steps, both directly brutal as well as sort of quote-unquote legal. That is that they smashed the looms in many cases in many places. In at least one documented incident, documented by a contemporary Dutch observer, they chopped off the thumbs of weavers. I mean, these are people who are producing cloth so fine. I mean, the famous Dhaka gauzes, you know, light as woven air, it used to be said. And all of these products which were exported around the world, basically the British destroyed their production, significantly prevented the kind of quality and large-scale production that was taking place. And then on top of that, they also imposed punitive taxes and tariffs on Indian goods being exported to Britain, while having practically no tariffs at all on their goods coming into India. Since they controlled India and Indian ports, they could do that. So the result was that through both this combination of taxes and tariffs on the one hand, and the physically violent action against textiles and weavers on the other, they destroyed the industry. Dhaka, for example, became one of the first few places in the world to actually lose population. Large numbers of weavers were thrown out of work. And of course, this essentially meant that when industry, I mean, textiles itself became industrialized in the modern machinery sense in the West, the Indian textile industry didn't have the financial base or the ongoing production patterns or export markets to adapt themselves to that technology either.
And you write in your book that what happened to the textile industry was replicated right across the board.
That's right. I give the examples of shipbuilding and steel as two examples. Shipbuilding is striking because Indian ships were actually extremely highly regarded around the world, partially because our wood was so much better, the teak that we used and the sal, that Indian ships lasted an average of 24 years after building, whereas British ships had a maximum of 7 years lifespan because of, again, they were based on fir or pine. And the problem was that the craftsmanship in Europe was simply not up to the standards of Indian shipping. So once again, significant dismantlement, making it impossible for ships made in India to sail to lucrative markets like China or to lucrative ports like London, essentially squeezing them out of the business. And once again, when technological change happened eventually, India was again pushed out of the business. Steel. Steel was an interesting example because India was the country that started making what was called ukku steel, which the Europeans transliterated wrongly as wood steel. Now, Indian steel was so famous that the Arabs took it and took that technology from India to create the famous Damascus steel. But India continued making wonderful steel products, particularly swords, so that when the British first attacked India, came to India, the stories are told of British soldiers shooting Indians and then dismounting from their horses to steal the swords of the Indian troops they had just killed because the Indian swords were so much superior to any swords available in Europe. Now, this was the kind of industry we had. It was completely wrecked to the extent that the technology essentially was lost because no one was allowed to make it anymore. Whatever steel was made, of course, was made in the Western world. And then when modern steel-making procedures came, they were denied to India. It was only when Jamshedji Tata, in the teeth of implacable British opposition, kept on trying, that he finally, at the end of his life, was able to establish the Tata steel mills, but the first production actually happened after his death because he had to overcome so much of resistance to an Indian producing steel. In fact, a British imperial official of that time sneered that, that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. And it's somewhat regrettable that he didn't live long enough to see the descendants of the same Mr. Tata acquiring the remnants of British steel when they bought Chorus a few years ago. Anyway, that's that. But that's so across the board, there was a deindustrialization of India which preceded and made possible the industrialization of Britain.
Now, in your famous Oxford Union speech, you spent a certain amount of time talking about the railways, and many people look upon the railways as one of the great achievements of the Raj. But what you point out is that the exorbitant cost at which they were built, they actually were a form of loot. And if I'm recalling correctly, you say in your book, and I'm quoting you, the railways were a big British colonial scam. It was a splendid racket for everyone apart from the Indian taxpayer. Explain to the audience why you believe that the construction of the railways wasn't a boon, but actually intended as a scam, and why it was loot.
Well, because the British, first of all, what was their intention in building railways? From the start, the concept was very clear. It is a way of getting into the Indian hinterland, to extract Indian resources to take them to Britain, to send labor in and out more easily to extract these resources, and to ship them from the ports elsewhere. As far as people were concerned, it was great to move British officers around, but the Indian public's traveling needs were totally incidental. Number two, when they actually were building the railways, they promised British investors the most extravagant rates of return, whether or not the railways proved profitable. So it became the best investment available in England. If you invested in the Indian railways, you got a guaranteed rate of return that no other investment was able to provide. And so the result was that every mile of Indian railway cost, for the first 2 decades of Indian railway building, 9 times as much, and thereafter at least 5 times as much as the equivalent mile in the US or Canada or Australia. And that meant that essentially it was a scam, for the profit was as described at the time as private profit at public risk. The problem was the private profit went to Brits, the public risk was paid by the Indians. On top of that, there were various racist practices in the actual use of the railways. Everything from ticket collectors to station masters had to be white Europeans. When in the end that became unsustainable in the 20th century, they started hiring the people they could find as closely approximate to white Europeans as possible, so some Parsis, some Sikhs, but again in very restricted capacities and with not much opportunity. The Anglo-Indians were then seen as the sort of most like the Brits to man the railways. Very, very racist enterprise. And on top of all of that, of course, these poor third-class carriages in which Indians traveled had primitive conditions, wooden benches, and yet had the highest passenger rates in the world, whereas British companies could ship their goods on the cheapest freight rates in the world. So it was completely and blatantly an exercise to benefit Britain and British companies and British interests, and not at all designed for Indians. Of course, after independence, we were able to transform the use of the railways. One of the things India did was to progressively improve conditions for the Aam Aadmi traveler, to actually now create amongst the cheapest rail fares in the world for the ordinary traveler, while increasing freight costs perhaps too much. But that balance has been redressed principally in order to compensate for the opposite pattern during the British Raj.
Now, where I found your book particularly interesting but also surprising is when you extend the argument that you've made about the industry, about the railways, to the development of poverty. You say, and I'm quoting you once again, that rural poverty was a direct result of British actions. And one of your arguments is that by monopolizing industrial production, as you put it, right across the board, the British drove Indians to agriculture in numbers that the land simply couldn't sustain. And the net result was that by the time we got our country at independence, we had a legacy of grinding rural poverty, which the British had created.
Absolutely. The British created both landlessness and rural poverty, and that's something that many Indians don't realize. The fact is that, to begin with, as you said, deindustrialization drove large numbers of people unsustainably to rural areas and to agricultural professions that in the past they didn't have to practice because there were these other options available. Secondly, the British completely ignored the normal practices of landholding in our country. In many cases, in their desire to create what was called a permanent settlement in some parts of northern India, Cornwallis's famous permanent settlement, but also elsewhere, they often converted the people who had basically been rent collectors into permanent landowners and reduced, therefore, the tillers of the land into tenant farmers living in the mercy of the landlords. Worse, the British also ignored the traditional way in which taxation had been conducted. As much as we can document from the past, in India, agricultural taxation was at about a maximum of 15% of the value of the crop, or 15% of the crop in kind. Whereas when the British came in, oh, and besides that, the Indian custom was such that if, for example, there was a drought or a famine, the king would waive the tax that year, or if there was a festival or a daughter's wedding or whatever, due allowance would be made for either delayed payment or reduced payment or both. All of those cultural practices that existed in Indian villages were completely and ruthlessly cast aside by the Brits. They taxed at a minimum of 45%, and very often 85 to 90%, and in one period, in one place, 100% of the crop was taxed by the British. There was absolutely no discussion, no allowance, no consideration for droughts, famines, festivals, anything. You paid, or you were pilloried in public places, you were whipped, you were tortured.